Nice to see everyone. A Satsuma button, and it's being magnified for our view. So first of all, the button blanks are obtained from a potter who fires the button with the first clear glaze to achieve the fine crackling. Once the design is decided, a rough copy with a very thin water-based ink pen is made on the blank ceramic button, and this mark will evaporate when the button is fired in the kiln. With a very fine, thin brush made of weasel hair, an outline is made using matted gold or platinum mixed with oil. The ceramic is painted, and then it is baked in an electric kiln for over 4 hours. After baking, it is allowed to be cooled, and the painting and the baking process is repeated for refinement till it gets to a pleasing touch to the artist who's creating it. These are all handmade, obviously. So in effect, more than 12 hours is spent on one button, because this is devotion to beauty. By every definition, it is a miniature work of art, each and every one of them. It's lovely to see. A very warm welcome to everyone. Thank you for sharing your afternoon with us for our 83rd presentation. If you look at the Satsuma button, it is of undeniable beauty because it is the beauty of, again, of devotion. Imagine the time spent doing this, the beauty that comes through patience, the beauty of technical finesse, because there's a chemistry in grinding the colors, in creating it. All of this, years of practice, heritage handed down. Absolutely, it's the beauty of artisanship. And for me, the beauty of solitude, to be mesmerized by your own work, because one would have to be. It is a beauty that is meditation. And this ability to see slowly, that is the central theme for today's presentation. Today's story, buttons are a facsimile for life, alerting us to pay attention to our own lives. Because like the button, life is circular, it repeats. And this pattern, hopefully, will be made evident through this small, typically round object, which is the button. So functionally, buttons fasten. And prior to buttons, we wore less form-fitted clothing, because if you don't have buttons, things are more diaphanous, they're draping you. And so we had a more flowing style. And the reason that is being pointed out is fashion reflects society. And one function of the button is to help cover, albeit initially it was all decoration, ornamentation. It used to cover us decorously. That's what it did. But obliquely, this presentation, I will consider it a success if it makes one ponder about that aspect of a button, which is all about cloaking. Because carefully look, in this painting, Cupid is matched with his love, who is Psyche. What that is showing is the union between physical love and that of the soul, because Psyche is representing the soul. And if you look to the right of the two lovers, the figure on the right is Modesty. She's naked. In an original drawing of this, she didn't have a veil on her whatsoever, because Modesty here is representing the naked truth. She has no need of shame because she is without blame. So it's unrestricted beauty, unrestricted power. If you keep that in mind, she's not being covered up whatsoever, no buttons here whatsoever. With that concept in mind, why do we have this? Does one really think that the Romans cared enough to drape him when they were crucifying him? What exactly were the attitudes of the people that tied divinity to shame, to cover up? Because that's all it's being showing. And this is across the ages. Fra Angelico did it as well. And the one I looked carefully through crucifixion paintings, Delacroix, he was the one who came closely to boldness. Because if you look carefully, what you see there is a circumcised Jew on a cross, which would probably enrage anti-Semites because there's a lot of meaning in these paintings. But again, Delacroix could take the courage to paint it because he wasn't really a practicing Christian. This presentation is not on religion. What it's attempting to do is tell the story. What does it mean to be cloaked and covered up? One nice way of showing that is the Spragonard painting because it sums it really well. The key to this painting is that the pleasure found in abandonment, to abandon oneself to physical sensation. So a close-up, there she is frolicking, unfettered. So the allusions to sensual and sensuous pleasures was firmly rooted to the cultural values of the 18th century France, where this was painted, and the norms of decorum linked to dress and undress. So if you think about it, look at the top half of her, it's buttoned up. But look on the bottom end. The button, there's no buttons in the skirts because skirts could be buttoned. And in fact, as the story goes on, they will be tightly fitted skirts. That's what buttons are doing. So in this painting, one sees the buttonless skirts billowing in freedom to the joy of her lover, who is hidden behind the rose bushes because a young lady there is definitely married. Her husband is in the back. Look closely what is being shown. If you notice now, I'm going to point. Notice the little cherub there, the putto, I guess, with a finger to his lips, saying, shh, don't laugh too loudly. Your husband in the back will catch you and pull in all the ropes, binding you up, buttoning you up again. I love looking at these pictures. Look at them watching her with joy. Look at the glee on her face. There is a husband. He is not seeing the lover in the back. If you look at the painting more, the blown up of it, you will see a dog in the bottom about to yell because I'm sure the dog senses, that is not my master. Who be that? It's really fun to notice all this. So that is the point of today's story. And I really hope you get the joke why I selected this picture. Because look, belly button. That's the reason this was chosen as the cover for today's story. Attempt at cuteness. I hope you think it's cute because that is a term, isn't it? Cute as a button. So now think about that. Why do we say that? Cute as a button. Why are we restricting a divinely beautiful creation of nature to the context of a man-made object, a button? Because these are called button roses. This is a button rose vase, not just a rose vase. The reason it's being remarked is that the button has now become a beautifying adjective, a button vase. Button used to only be a noun, but with the invention of a buttonhole, that word, a button, becomes a verb, as in to button up, to be buttoned up. Do you see why I'm wearing this today? I'm completely buttoned up. I tried to put a lot of thought in this, actually do all the time. So what exactly is this story going to be about? Well, okay. The Nourishment Projects is about joyous curiosity and being part of something much larger than ourselves. Here are some of the references that's going to hopefully communicate a story that is much more than any objects that are being shown. I hope it comes across well today. The story will be tied up by the end of the hour, and so we'll circle right back to this same picture. So hold me to that. So let's take the long view. Buttons have been around for a very long time, from nearly 3,000 years ago. Archaeology reveals that the first buttons were found in the area of Mohenjo-daro, which is the area now between India and Pakistan, so around present-day India. Initially, they were purely decorative and they were used to signify power and status. The only difference now is that now, allowing, not only do they signify status, because one wears Chanel for a reason. Make no mistake, fashion is a calling card. But the buttons here also serve a purpose. So now buttons are both form and function. That is the one big difference. Materials have changed over time. And by time, I mean centuries. They've gone from organic, bone, wood, shell, to all the way it's going from iron, horn, these are all organic materials, to present day plastic. And this may look like shell. How do you tell it between a shell button and a plastic button? First of all, shell buttons will be heavier. Plastic are much lighter, and shell will feel cooler to your skin. The process of creation also reflects the material being chosen. So shells are made, shell buttons, when they are made, are very manually intensive because you have to cut them by hand. These are hand processed things, intricately carved and polished. These are not metal made. Plastic buttons, on the other hand, were machine produced, automated. And so factory produced stuff uses less people. So you can see how this is applicable to automation of this day and age. And now with 3D printing, there will be even less human involvement across these manufacturing processes, because all of this is genuflecting to efficiency. That is why we started with the Satsuma button. With the very few exception of factory produced signature lalik pieces, because lalik vases are manufactured, automated prices, and they are gorgeous things, even though they're not handmade. Other than that, efficiency is hardly an ideal that I aspire for. These, by every definition, to me, make each button takes more than a day. It is not efficient. But would you ever throw away an inefficient product like this? I would treasure them. I don't care that it's inefficiently made. You're not working in the realms of efficiency or inefficiency here. You're working on an entirely different spectrum. So today's story is, again, not about buttonholes or how one puts on a button, because both those subject matters could take its own hour, because a lot is revealed simply in the shanks that attaches the button to the textile. So what perspective is today's story going to take? Again, look for a broader picture. As an example, how do I define a success for today's presentation? Hopefully, when next you see, for example, a painting, notice the buttons that were always clearly front and center, hidden in view. She's saying something when this is how she was being projected. She chose to be painted, whoever this is. To her, to show the buttons up front, it is showing she has wealth and power. That is what it's showing. Because make no mistake, only in the mid-19th century did women start wearing buttons. Before that, this was an accessory for males primarily. So when you then see jodhpurs and the buttons and this female attire on her spats also that are covering her shoes, it is telling you something about this person. She's obviously wealthy. Sorry, someone has to be admitted. So one of the few humble examples that can be given is how the salesperson used to carry their buttons to make the vendors buy them. They used to go around carrying these sample books to sell the buttons. They're still so beautiful, just the way that they were carried. Buttons still, if you look at it, look how beautifully these decorate a waistcoat. And these are one of the more humbler examples that are being given. When you see these waistcoats up close, if you go to any of the museums, go to the textile section and just ask to look at the button. They'll take your breath away. They also communicate profession. The one on the left is showing someone who worked on the ship, and the one on the right, a railroad employee. So they communicate profession and much more. How do I view a button? So if you look at this, as a mother of two who are soon going to be going to college, sewing a button is good practice for future surgeons. I am an Indian mother. Tiger mother is what you call us, right? I expect my children to become doctors. So even though they might be doing surgery, guiding a robotic arm, my uncle used to be a heart surgeon, and he had said it's important for them to know how to sew because it lets them practice fine detail work. So I expect my son knows how to sew, albeit badly, but he's getting better. So sewing is important across the board, more than just putting a button on, but that's how I see the value of a button for now. So speaking of my uncle, let's turn to men. Initially, like I said, men were the ones who used buttons. Buttons were decorative objects because it denoted power. And power for a very, very long time was associated with men, and men wore buttons to show how wealthy they were. So we have to start somewhere for today's presentation. And I thought, let's start with him, 16th century, the first Duke of Buckingham. It's been documented that in 1620, he had a suit and cloak made that were covered in diamond buttons. This painting that looks so somewhat drab may make you doubt the veracity, but Rubens, Peter Paul Rubens, didn't capture him well because look at him in a different world. Remember, during these times of the 16th century, pearls are exorbitantly expensive. So this peacock, the first Duke of Buckingham, had his entire outfit made of diamond buttons. And buttons were equally important, signifying power. All the aristocracy during those times, all the kings, King Francis I, Charles I, Louis XIV, all of them, they valued their buttons. And so when you keep this in mind, it's rather a jolt to see this photograph from the 18th century, what men looked like then, how they were dressed. But again, I apologize, the picture is a bit hazy, but some of the old books, the photographs aren't very clear. This is the best that I could do. But I ask you again, look closely and look slowly. The waistcoat buttons on the man are dictated by the times of his society. And so the size, the number of the buttons on his waistcoat, the elongated shanks that adhere the button to his waistcoat itself, those were all dictated. They will be telling you something. His son's button will be bigger than that of the father, which makes sense because he's younger, his fingers are clumsy. If we move forward, again, apologies for the haziness. The man's waistcoat may be single, as on the left, or double-breasted with buttons. But again, all the buttons will be signifying wealth, status, the man's position in society, the society groups and clubs he belongs to. They're all being shown through his buttons. So the style, the size, the color, all communicate a deliberate message. That is what they're using back then to communicate. Also, another way that is being communicated, the buttons that are left open communicated something. In this case, it communicated that Edward VII was putting on some weight that he couldn't button up, but the people in his court started following the style. And so they used to leave some of the buttons on their coats open. They followed suit, they followed fashion. The number of buttons on a coat or a waistcoat is important. It's very telling. So we're moving up in time now. When depicting Gatsby, even in the movies, look at the commonality. When Gatsby is depicted by Robert Redford, him on the right, even though it's double-breasted suit, it's showing who has the one with more power. Three-button suit. And when this 1974 version of the movie was remade by Leonardo DiCaprio as Great Gatsby in 2013, look, they retained the three-button suit. That stays because not all suits are three-buttoned. The 1960s brings in the two-button suit as depicted by the seemingly power-hungry Don Draper. Look at his name, Draper. It's telling the clothing mattered in the TV series Mad Men. So men might indeed consider it a madness, some men, to wear a two-button suit, because some men will not wear this at all. suit buttons have a far more interesting story. And I'm going to show you where. Let's go back now in history. Meet a 19th century Rachel. This woman was brave enough to divorce her first husband, and then later she fell in love with a lawyer who was equally enamored of her. He eventually becomes our president, Andrew Jackson. The dates of her actual divorce and remarriage have overlapped on a technicality because her first husband didn't want to give her the divorce and sued her. But anyway, by the time all of this was done, it was a huge scandal. And the scandal carried through even when he was running for president. And there were a lot of talks, tails wagged. And this depiction of a cartoon showed somebody, I forgot the man's name, a Mr. I don't remember the name now, but this man had besmirched his wife's name. And so Andrew Jackson challenged him to a duel. So the story is the night before the duel, Jackson's friend, a Mr. Overton, had convinced Andrew Jackson to wear a coat with big silver buttons. And as the story was told, one of the buttons helped save his life from a bullet. The bullet hit the button and saved his life. The man who challenged Jackson, his name was Dickinson. I just realized it says Jackson Dickinson duel. So I'm assuming the man's name was Dickinson. Sometimes I have a brain blip. Dickinson died. He didn't have such luck with the buttons. So buttons had many purposes in Andrew Jackson's life, including campaign buttons. The reason I'm showing this, when we hear a campaign button now, we think the pin-on ones that we see more. But originally, these were actual buttons for the suit. Because the buttons now are pinback buttons, original buttons were part of the attire. And these are collector's items. Here are the ones from George Washington. Again, I apologize for some of the hazy pictures because these are hard to find from the books. But online, I was able to find, look what it looked like. This rare one was sold in 2018 for nearly $250,000. Pater Patria says founding father. That's what it says. And the other one of the Washington buttons that I really liked, although I can never buy these, nor do I ever want to, here are his initials, GW, surrounded by the 13 colonies, the original 13 colonies depicted on the button itself, which he would be wearing. And what was the point of these? Even the simpler ones here, they would have been made and manufacturers would sell them as a set, and the ones who wore them would show respect to the office of the president. Again, all these buttons are collector's items and makes you wonder, what exactly did George Washington wear when he was inaugurated? In the archives, they say that he wore a wool coat of a deep brown with buttons that had eagles on them. So these buttons were important. They're signifying something. And obviously, there are many commemorative buttons from both his elections because he ran twice. And you can get all of these through the auction houses. You get other buttons as well, Civil War buttons. Look at the craftsmanship. I just think they're so sweet. I really admire the craftsmanship of these things. You also get buttons from, I did not know this has happened, the California militia had buttons. What I liked about this, because I looked at it deeply, I'm like, what is it that they're showing? Keep in mind, because there was the California Gold Rush, I like the sense of humor of whoever designed the button, because look what it says. It says Eureka on top of the button. And obviously, whoever designed it was educated because the term Eureka was used by the mathematician. Remember Archimedes' principle? He figured out how to know if the gold crown was real or not because of the amount of the water that would have been displaced. That's the term that they had shrieked out. He apparently had said, Archimedes had said when he figured out if the crown was real or not by said Eureka. So when they made the gold buttons for California, they put that term in because you associate California with the gold rush. I like that. It made me smile because I always have a hard time figuring out what pictures do I want to include in these presentations. So as we move forward, look at, again, the craftsmanship is really, because these are all handmade. A button that I want to call to your mind nothing to do with campaign buttons. This had to do with Teddy Roosevelt. So it's a non-campaign presidential button. So during the time of this cartoon, President Teddy Roosevelt was concerned with settling a dispute between Mississippi and Louisiana. Apparently, the hunting-loving president, Teddy Roosevelt, had been offered a bear cub to shoot. And obviously, you can say he does not want to do this. He has standards. The cub even had a name, Bruin. So because President Roosevelt had refused, it became a story because a cartoonist kept drawing it and made tons of illustrations. So eventually somebody made a button with it and came up with a design that interested a lot of people, the Teddy button. And this is what is associated with the teddy bear, the Teddy Roosevelt bear. All these stories come from that time because the story of him not shooting the bear was publicized through the cartoons. That's how these terms come up, because there's often many stories that come up with, how did the teddy bear get its name? This is what helped make it popular. So when we move forward, animals show up and insects and creatures show up in buttons. Roosevelt was not the only one associated with it. In the early 21st century, Elsa Schiaparelli, she included insects in her designs because interloping insects crawling on high-style clothing and jewelry was to her surrealist declaration because she likes surrealist artwork. Here is Schiaparelli with a friend, Salvador Dali, and Dali had designed this, well, it's surreal, a telephone with a lobster on the top. Why am I showing you this? Schiaparelli had designed a dress onto which Dali had painted a lobster. Now, if you look closely, look exactly where on the woman's anatomy the lobster's tail starts on this ivory dress. The owner obviously had to have a sense of humor to have worn this dress. And to say that this owner of the dress had a sense of boldness is an understatement, because no one gives you a woman like that, a prized catch worth more than a lobster too. The future king, well, by then he was the king of England, and he abdicated for her, the Duke of Windsor. Because even now, look at the dress, when they make it, this is how it becomes classic. They don't place the lobster in the same place where it was originally drawn. There's a boneless in there. I think she is liked for her style, not despite her style. Boldness is quite intoxicating. In comparison, how do men show stuff? They show their watches. I sometimes feel badly for men. Their styles are much more timid in some style, but there are still men who can show style through their buttons because that is how men used to do so way back. And there are still some men who choose to put care into the details. Back about 150 years ago, they were less subtle. The buttons and the buckles were big. Bigger was better for them. And the cartoon on the right is again a hoot because what it's trying to show with these rays coming out of the button is that the buttons are dazzling the woman, almost blinding her with beauty. That's what it is showing in this picture. Do you see these rays coming out of his chest? They're showing that the buttons was dazzling silver buttons and jewel buttons are catching her off guard. She's mesmerized by them. And it made me think, well, what about the women? Didn't they care for buttons? Didn't they wear them? Well, of course they did. But for this to happen, the Industrial Revolution had to occur. Because mass production freed women, it allowed them to get a job. They worked, they enjoyed freedom, they gained power, and they began to wear that aforementioned symbol of power, buttons. The irony is, the more buttoned up they were, they looked more restricted, don't they? Previously, they held their clothes together with laces and hooks, but now they began to incorporate buttons. Women and the options for women in their garments of button blossomed. The more buttoned up they became. I found that to be such an irony. And not just women, because now they were more accessible. Babies wore them too, baby shoes included. And what I love is children's buttons are fun because they include a very delightful category called fable buttons, because the buttons there tell a story. This one of Aesop's fables of the fox and the crow, where the fox tries to convince the crow to talk so he could drop up food. The crow was smarter than the fox. And here at the back, and the reason I'm showing this is just to show context. The quarter is giving you a size of the buttons for the children, and they are bigger because, again, the children's fingers are not that dexterous yet. Another fable button, the fox and the grape. Eventually, the fox says, I don't want the grape, because he couldn't get the grape. There are endless varieties to buttons because they are used to express themselves. The more antique the buttons, the more diverse they are. They're really lovely to look at. I especially loved this gold one. The leaves almost look heart-shaped. It's charming. This one is equally arresting because these are amethyst, moss agate, and split pearl buttons. And not just the buttons itself, the boxes that they came in. Because they were jewel, people kept them. They kept them very carefully, and they changed the buttons in their outfits. Sometimes they were silver, sometimes they were semi-precious, and this one were buttons worn by a professional who worked on a ship. So they treasured these things. They were meant to be treasured. And I don't know if some of you know this, along with the buttons, they came button hooks because the sheer number of the buttons and the size of the buttons, even an adult finger couldn't work it out. So you need button hooks to actually fasten your clothing together. Can you imagine, in fact, buttoning your boots when you have so many to button up? These cloth buttons, look at that. You will need a button hook. And what's fun is, here are the button hooks for your shoes, but they had a sense of fun even there. Here is a button hook for your shoe for the riding boots, and the button hook itself represents a horse. I like these details. People had a sense, they had a flair. It's lovely. Imagine the amount of time it took this lady to get ready. It would make sense, would it not? Why there would be a great need for maids during those times. I took a picture from Downton Abbey to get dressed, not only for the time saving, but also because you have buttons in the back. How on earth are you going to button yourself all the way down? So this is another way you're signifying wealth. You can wear such a dress where you're so buttoned in because somebody's dressing you. You have money. And what's true for Europe is also true in Japan. Again, I'm taking these stills from a movie. Look how she's buttoned up. I took this picture because observe her gloves. Gloves had button hooks too for the gloves themselves. When they are that small, you need special hooks to button your gloves. So obviously, no doubt the wealthy from Japanese needed maids to get ready for their kimonos, but it also became true when the Western style came into Japan. So all that is taking place in the backdrop. And on an offshoot, for those who have not seen this movie, The Handmaiden, it's based on a book by Wilkie Collins, you will gasp at the beauty and the audacity and the humor of this movie. It is a moody movie, but I promise you it's a rated R, not recommended for anybody underaged. But I genuinely hope my children see the movie when they grow up. It is lovely. So why am I including it in this story? Why did we come to Japan? Look how much we've covered from the Duke of Buckingham 400 years prior. He of the diamond buttons, remember? Covered in diamond buttons. We have now come to 20th century Japan. In between this, something important has happened. I'd alluded to it. It was the Industrial Revolution. This is showing currently now because you can extrapolate the message into what's going to be happening coming forward. It is the effect of manufacturing on society, how it changes. So there were effectively two industrial revolutions already. The first one, which to me can be called the English Revolution, because that's where it happened. it pivoted around the steam power. And the second industrial revolution, which happened mainly after World War I, had to do with more steel and metal in the production, which happens around the World War II, all the way up to the World War II area. Either way, the Industrial Revolution is about the effects of manufacturing on society. And so now look, when you extrapolate these stories, we come to modern times, go to China. Less than 50 years ago, this country was a communist state, closed economy. And now it has become a global manufacturing powerhouse. Take that in, look at the change in China. It has gone from an agricultural place into massively powerful urban area. That's one story. But again, look slowly. That was the inspiration for this topic today, button, right? Small things that communicate a very, very large and powerful message. Let's go to this area called Chao To, which is currently, or at least for the past few years, been the button capital of the world, producing more than 60% of the world's buttons. So within 10 years, when they started, they overtook that designation of becoming the button capital of the world, or one of the major producers of button. Used to be Italy, now it's China. What does that mean actually? What is the lived experience of becoming a powerhouse in button making? Here are women working in factories, making buttons. And if you look at it, it's mainly women working there, earning a living. Now, here comes tradition. Decades before, when China had just opened up economically, it took this previous generation the courage to want to earn money openly. Because remember, this is communist China. Attitude towards money is very different then. Having to borrow money to set up a stall to sell buttons. These women had to endure ridicule and shame. And this is a very huge communal culture. All of which, all this shame, all this having the courage to go out and, yes, I want to make money, all this go away as soon as success arrives, because everyone salutes the rising sun. And so from one stall or two, they become thousands of stalls. They take the money and invest in manufacturing. So you use money to make money. Then hire others, share their ability to become successful, empower others. So they're effectively changing the trajectory of the lives of this child, a very different lifestyle and mind than the grandmother holding the child. All because of buttons and the success that it brought in. Button changed that town in China. Imagine the women who changed their surrounding by making these small buttons, to have the courage to take on economy and entrepreneurship. This small thing made massive change in their lives. It's no small feat, and it worked because of poverty. Agricultural life wasn't sustainable, and so they were forced to find alternatives. So from that agriculture, look at this tree of life. What makes them flourish now is buttons. And because there's so much competition now, they practically sell them for nothing. So that, their own success is eating them alive. But this metal structure lets us leap back another commemoration. This time, if you look in Muscatine, Iowa, here in America, early 20th century, late 19th century, Iowa, not too far away from here, right by the Mississippi River. This river used to be festooned with mussel clams. And tariffs on German imports had forced a German immigrant to find economic options. And he used to make shell buttons in Germany. And he found out that there could be shells in the rivers of Mississippi. So Mr. John Bopel came to America to find a source for his pearl buttons. He bet on it, and his bet paid off. And he transformed the town of Muscatine into a powerhouse of button making. by then, Muscatine, Iowa used to produce almost 30% of the global buttons, pearl buttons back then. So again, the reason this has been included, the story of America, the success of America is the story of immigration in almost every state. Men found the clams. Look, they went up and down the Mississippi River finding these clams. And inside the clams, when you open them up, here is the pearly luster for the shell buttons. They would drill and cut them. And then women worked to make these shells. So again, just like in China now, they earned a living, they raised their family. And eventually this shell button died out because they started making plastic buttons through industrial age. Because automation, it was cheaper to do. It killed the pearl industry. But that is a separate story. These shell buttons, what it also did, the beauty of the buttons, encouraged collecting buttons. People collected them. And I just love the fact, look, history repeats over and over. In the early days, little girls used to make what's called charm strings. They used to make strings of 1,000 buttons. Each button had to be obtained or exchanged with others, so they couldn't just buy their own buttons. And each button had to have a shank so that they could be threaded and made into a long charm, a string for them. The story is they borrowed and exchanged 999 buttons. The 1,000th button should come from their to-be husband. That's the story. So effectively, when you see all this, look how it's aptly called charming. All the variety that goes in here. This is all community showing up in craftsmanship, which reminded me, because it's so reminiscent of what goes on in the creation and design of the charm bracelets that you see in a Taylor Swift concert, who is a global phenomena, isn't she? I like how history repeats. You can connect this thing. It makes, if the more of history you see it showing up in your daily life. And that is what brings me to the end of our presentation today. Is because, look, if you think of it, we started off with the Satsuma buttons from Japan. We covered Europe, Duke of Buckingham, England. We went to America. We talked about China. And now we are in India, a tropical country where historically men and women were styled more in a draping format than buttoned. And that's true, including the gods. Because it is a hot country, why would you be buttoned up? The clothing styles were entirely different. Recollect again from the pantheons of the Greeks and the Roman gods, modesty is unnecessary for divinity, both the celestial, because you see it in the Indian drapings, and those on earth. This is how women used to be in India before the Mughals came in and the British came in. Upper bodies were generally adorned with jewelry or draped with cotton or linen because it was very hot. It is still very hot there. Into that world, through colonization, comes the Victorian mindset. So exactly what happens? Well, you can guess. Through actually education and shame, because how is this happening? You bar people access unless they are dressed, unless the indigenous is represented in the accepted Western style of buttoning up. The entire culture changes. Look how much it has changed. You can even see it in the lowest of the servings there, right? Servants. You can see who has the higher ranking in the servant class, the one who's wearing a coat with buttons. Here is one of them. If you look, the more closely you look, the more you see. The rest of them are not buttoned in that sense. He is the one with the power among the servants. Tallest hobbit, he's wearing a coat with buttons. All of this is communicating something. What does it mean when you change an entire culture? You button up people in India for what? It's a hot country. You're not doing it to clothe them, to keep them warm because they're already hot. what it's effectively happening, buttons are putting people in place, stratified, just like the servants. Just like the one who's buttoned up in the serving class is the higher among the servants, the status of women changed beyond recognition to be hemmed in, laced up. Look at the difference. Buttoned up. What does it do to the psyche, to the long-term effects of a nation, or just to a human being? You shouldn't be buttoned up. Like nature, one should blossom into beauty. That is the end of today's presentation. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope the message comes across even though it wasn't directly stated. I'm going to stop sharing now